If you are anything like me, you get obsessed about solving problems. And if you're into business specifically, you may well have heard of Alex Hormozy. And the thing that he talks about a lot is identify the constraint, right? If you work on the constraint, you unlock the rest of the growth. And this is mostly in a business context, but this applies across the board, right? If you're, if you're trying to become an athlete, if you're trying to improve your health or some other aspect of your life, at the end of the day, identifying the constraint is what lets you make the most progress. It's you just have to think about it like you are blocked by, if you have three different stats, you're going to be blocked by the lowest one. You can only get to that level, and then like, so if you work on the third pillar that's really high already, like you're not going to make any progress because this is your constraint. That's this idea, and it's really good. And I took a long time to internalize it. I think probably more than I should have, but basically I wanted to talk about how I have thought about identifying the constraint recently. Like, this has been a very big reflection of mine because I like fundamentally can understand that identifying the constraint is really important, but how do you go about doing that, right? How do you actually find said main constraint? The issue is oftentimes you misidentify the constraint. Even if you can conceptually understand this idea that you need to work on the constraint, you then need to be able to correctly identify it. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And the first thing for me what I started to realize is that it begs the question of data. What data are you actually tracking, so that you can answer the question? So for me, one of the things I've recently implemented in my business has been like just identifying three key areas. For example, client acquisition, client results and retention, right? And satisfaction, and then team happiness and satisfaction and performance. And so it's like team, client results, client acquisition, three key areas. Which one's the constraint? And then, within those, like, okay, what are the data metrics? And so it might be like I literally just started by trying to identify 3 to 5 metrics for each of those that are like relatively easy to implement. I don't want to be investing in insane data infrastructure because it's going to create more friction to get there. Over time, of course, you want that. But to start with, just start simple, right? So 3 things for, let's say, client acquisition: show rates, close rates, and what was the last one was number of appointments per week. I was just blanking a little bit. And so I was like, okay, how am I going to get that? I basically got my assistant to make a table for all of the meetings I've had over the past 6 months. And I'm going through and analyzing all of those meetings. What was this? What was that? Was this a prospect? Was it not? Did I close? Did they not? And immediately on this reflection, I can start to see my problem is not my close rate. My problem is not my show rate. My problem is the number of weekly appointments, for example. And that's the constraint of client acquisition. Then you have to look at the other ones and be, okay, is client acquisition the biggest constraint between acquisition, results, and team? And so you track other things. And in my team, for example, some of it is qualitative data. So I have surveys that are sent out every Friday, and they're automated. Well, by more automated, my assistant sends them. And basically the team just responds every Friday, and I get what their take on like what was productive, what wasn't, but also a rating on their satisfaction, a rating on how they feel like in terms of productivity. And then, one thing, qualitative data is good, but then what are the numbers, right? And now I run a development agency, and if you know about development, you'll probably, well, like, GitHub is what we use, and we basically started using this tool that tracks PRs and stuff like that. And so we can manage our project PRs through said tool, and we'll get a bunch of analytics. What is our average PR close time? What is the average time to merge? Basically, like, how quickly do we ship stuff to production? How many commits are there? What is our development velocity? And all these kinds of metrics. This tool comes out of the box with them, so it's really good. So it's like more than 3 metrics. But, in this case, we do need more than 3 metrics because it's like, it's a little bit hard to measure team performance on code produced alone, because sometimes it can take a long time to produce a little bit of really good code. But yeah, so I have some qualitative data on team satisfaction and performance. I have some quantitative data on team performance. Okay, a starting point, and then client results, and then again, we can go in a qualitative route because like what is things like net promoter score. For me, that doesn't really make sense, but like, I mean, maybe I might, but whatever. I'll probably start sending out surveys to clients, but I'm also thinking about what is our demo to first value add, right? Like how many touch points on a weekly basis do we have on average? Um, and I even thought like how much time between each request and it being implemented. Now that data is really useful, but it would be a little bit more troublesome to implement because then we need to start implementing, like we need to track feature requests and then track their specific implementation and they're not linked to PR. Like basically it's just a little bit more complicated for us to set up. And so I was like, I'll put that, I'll kind of I'll box that for a phase two data push. But for now, those are some starting points. Um, and I think it's at least that's how I'm thinking about it right now. And maybe that's a useful way to think about it. Like it's I think the principle of focus and simplicity has helped me a lot with this. And just focusing, streamlining on what are the data points that will help me understand the constraint of the business. And then once you have the data, so part of it's looking at the right data. So first you need to learn what the right data is. Now, I cannot say that I am 100% confident that I have all the right data, but I have some. So first you need to have some data. Then you need to have the right data. Once you have the right data, you need probably the right benchmarks and things like that. So that's another point which like I'm kind of figuring out a little bit. But the you know what are the benchmarks for good performance on each of these metrics? Some of them will just be relevant to your business, and some of them will not. Some of them, like um, at close rates, I should try and look at other things. And also, just what do you consider good and satisfactory, right? Um, yeah, but I think I think that's a problem for later down the line. I think for the most part, like having some of this data helps you identify, like it just helps you identify very clear constraints. For me, it was number of weekly meetings. Weekly meetings, I mean, weekly pitches. Um, like just even that reflection about thinking about what stats I would track, I was like, immediately, I know this isn't going to be the problem. I know that's the first constraint that I have to work through. I've still been able to run a very profitable business, like relative to my experience and size. Obviously, it's a rink-a-dink business compared to the agencies that do millions a month, but I've I've been able to create a very good quality of life for myself without having done this, and so I'm quite excited about implementing a lot of this stuff, and that's just how I'm thinking about it right now. Like, but you can generally, at least in my take, is that you can identify the constraints as long as while you're relatively early on with relative ease. Like things typically there's something typically like if you feel stuck and totally bottle capped bottlenecked, um you can probably identify some clear constraint which is not working. But also this has begged the question about pivoting for me personally, because I considered like pivoting my business model many times. And I was thinking about it like, is there any point in time where the data points to a pivot? The reality is no, I don't think so, because there's so many reasons for a pivot. For example, unscalable client fulfillment. You want to build something bigger, and I mean, but then again, maybe that's your constraint, and you can just solve that by solving it for the current business model. Um, I think like there's no time that data necessarily justifies a pivot. but pivots still make sense sometimes. So do not look. Well, I mean, maybe look at the data. I don't know. Pivoting is hard. I saw Gary Vee say something about pivoting, which I thought made a lot of sense. Which is like there's people who have, you know, tried things 60 times, and on the 61st it worked, and they didn't pivot, and that was 100% worth it. But there's also people who've hammered on something for years, and it has not worked, and they need to pivot, swallow the pill, swallow their pride, swallow that hard pill, and just move on and do something else. There are examples of both. There is no magic recipe. It just, some things will work out at the 100th try, and sometimes they won't. And you don't know how many tries you need to get there, and you don't know if maybe you should try something else. So pivots are a tough one to crack, I think, but they're not always the answer. I think, especially when I was starting out, if you want to get into business and whatever, like I think I made so many mistakes in pivoting too much too quickly because I didn't understand constraints. And I was not focused on the constraints. I was focused on I had some intuitive idea of what I needed to do to grow, and that intuitive idea sucked. It was useless, for the most part. I mean, it was good to try stuff and learn stuff, but it was probably pretty useless. Otherwise, I would have grown. And I like this analogy that it's like the kitchen's on fire in your house and you go and mow the lawn. This is what most business owners tend to do. Guilty of it myself. But now, another thing I've implemented, which I think will be really useful, is I have weekly reflections. I've been doing these a while, but now I have more actively like weekly reflection reminders in Notion. And, it's good to do these reflections as well, but these specifically, it's like a template. I have to follow the said template. And there's a reason why I have the template, because I want myself to ask these questions every single week and not forget them, which is, what are my goals? And so even though I write the same goals every week, the goals don't change. The goals every single week, I just go back to the goals that I set at the start of the year. And so firstly, it's a reminder. It's not like the goals are already there. No, I'm not reading through this. The question is, what are the goals? And I have to write down bullet points. And every week, I'm going to write down the same 3 bullet points. And bear in mind, I said 3. I didn't say 10. I don't have 10 goals. I actually canceled some of my goals to focus better. I feel like this would probably justify another reflection of its own. But anyway, I have these reflections, and firstly, it's what are the goals? And then for each of these goals, I have a question. What is the constraint around this? What is the constraint around this? And what is the constraint around this? And it's actually what data, like look, it's actually in brackets, I put look at the data for each of these questions. And so I am reminding myself every single week to look at the data. What is the constraint? And, the constraint's not going to change week on week, but it's still good. Like people need to be reminded more than you need to be taught, right? So I look at the data, still the same constraint, good, still working on that. Look at the other, okay, still the same constraint. And there's one goal in like particular where I'm very much on track. And so I'm like, okay, good, just keep going. And I've also written myself in my main little goals page, just more, better, different. I think that's the order. Which helps me from, like I'm on track for this goal. This one of 3 goals. And so I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing there. And if anything, I can do more of it. I can do higher quality, but I don't need to, that goal is not the constraint, right? So in the case of my yearly goals, that goal is not the constraint. The other ones need to be, focused on. So this is, these have been my reflections around constraints and how to find the constraints. This is a question I found myself Googling. How do you find the constraint? How do you identify that? I know data is the start of my answer, but what's the second half and stuff like that. And maybe I'll make another reflection on just how to track more data once I have that. But yeah, I think it's super, super crucial to just figure things out. Figure things out. Of course, it's crucial to figure things out. I mean, figure out the constraint, identify the constraint properly. Do not misidentify the constraint, because misidentification of that will just lead you astray, right? It's like if the kitchen is on fire, it's somebody telling you that it's, the upstairs bedroom that's on fire, and you going there instead. You're going to waste your time. And people just go do something else. They go clean that upstairs bedroom because they think it's on fire, but it's not. Yeah. That, I did this a while ago, almost by accident, not by accident, but I identified a constraint, which was my fulfillment and delivery. I realized it was not good enough, up to speed on what I wanted personally, but also it was a constraint for the business, like retention and stuff. And then I shifted totally to focus on that. And 6 to 9 months later, like, the business more than doubled. That worked a lot, like really well. I didn't realize that I had properly identified the constraint there, but I had done that. But it was a mishap. Like, it was blind luck and not a reliable tactic. And so now I think these reflections will be very useful. Anyway, I'm excited about implementing that. I'm going to get back to that.